Good evening, everybody. I'm Eric Goldstein, the Judith London Evans Director of the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies here at Emory University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the annual Rothschild Memorial Lecture. It's our honor to have with us tonight the noted attorney, legal commentator, and award-winning writer and journalist, Dahlia Lithwick, who will be speaking on the demand for justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the Jewish tradition. Following the lecture, we'll have time for questions and answers, so please feel free to enter your questions anytime during the lecture using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Now in its 13th year, the Rothschild Lecture honors the memory of Rabbi Jacob M. Rothschild, the late spiritual leader of Atlanta's Hebrew Benevolent Congregation, known more commonly as the Temple. An important advocate for African-American civil rights and a friend and ally of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Rabbi Rothschild was a voice for social change in Atlanta and throughout the South during the stormy decades following World War II. Early one Sunday morning in 1958, the temple over which he presided on Peachtree Street was bombed by white supremacists who opposed his activism. But out of the ashes of destruction, Rabbi Rothschild galvanized his congregation and the larger Atlanta community to oppose the forces of hate even more strongly, causing his widow, the writer and historian Janice Rothschild Bloomberg, to later dub the attack the bomb that healed. To memorialize this legacy, each year the Tam Institute invites a guest scholar to deliver a lecture on a topic relevant to Rothschild's life's work in advancing social justice. Although we are on Zoom and I cannot ask them to stand as I usually do when we are in person, I want to recognize and thank Janice Rothschild Bloomberg and Janice and Rabbi Rothschild's son, Bill Rothschild, both of whom are in our audience tonight, for their support of this lecture and of the Tam Institute for Jewish Studies. We are so pleased to have them as valued members of our community of learning. I also want to thank and recognize Paul Entis, the executive director of the Tam Institute, and our communications coordinator, Brent Buckley, who are responsible for organizing all of the logistics of tonight's program. Finally, many thanks to the several partner departments and programs at Emory who have generously co-sponsored this event, namely the Bill and Carol Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry, the Center for Ethics, the Center for Women, Department of German Studies, Department of History, Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, the Department of Religion, the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life, and the Emory School of Law. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Dahlia Lithwick. Having received her JD from Stanford University, Dahlia initially practiced family law, but 2 decades ago, her focus shifted to covering law and legal culture as a journalist and writer. Since that time, she has become a leading commentator on law, politics, and the Supreme Court, most notably at Slate, where she is a senior editor and where she hosts Amicus, an award-winning biweekly podcast about the law and the Supreme Court. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, New Republic, and Commentary, and you will see her commentary regularly on a number of television outlets, including ABC, MSNBC, CNN, C-SPAN, and even The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. Most recently, you may have seen her coverage of the trial of the organizers of the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, including commentary on the expert testimony of our Jewish Studies colleague, Deborah Lipstadt. Aside from her journalistic work, Dahlia is a senior fellow of the Shalom Hartman Institute's Kogod Research Center and a lecturer at the University of Virginia School of Law, where she recently taught a course on the legacy of Justice Ginsburg. She is currently working on her 3rd book entitled Lady Justice, an exploration of women and the law in the current political climate, which will be published by Penguin. Dahlia has been widely recognized for her work. In 2013, she won a National Magazine Award for her columns on the Affordable Care Act. She has been twice awarded an Online Journalism Award for her legal commentary and was the first online journalist invited to be on the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press. In 2017, she received the Golden Pen Award from the Legal Writing Institute. And now it is my pleasure to welcome to the podium Dahlia Lithwick.
So thank you, first of all, to Eric, to Paul Entis, and to Brett Buckley for wrangling this event. And I want to thank Bill Rothschild and Janice Rothschild-Blumberg for the honor of including me in this amazing speaker series. And I also want to just apologize briefly in advance because I do have the dregs of a cold, and so I'm sounding a little more maybe Lauren Bacall than I had intended, but it is my honor and privilege to be with you tonight. And the title of my remarks is really a look at RBG and her Jewish legacy. And I wanted to start, if I may, because I don't get to do this nearly often enough, with a tiny little bit of Torah. And I was really struck in looking at this week's Torah portion, Vayetze. It seems so incredibly apt that this rolled around to coincide with my talk, because it seems like it is a portion that really lays out the template for a fully realized life. It opens with Jacob's dream of the ladder and the angels going up and down the ladder from earth up till heaven, ascending and descending, and Jacob having a deep reckoning with his spiritual life. And then it turns into this really beautiful pastoral love story, boy meets girl, boy marries girl sister, but creates a family and a tribe and a lasting legacy. And it feels as though for our purposes tonight together, both of these axes, both the work of ascending and descending, in the work of social justice, in the work of trying to make the world a better place, and this sideways axis of trying to build an intimate community, a life, a family, and a legacy that will survive you and move forward. These are both such paradigmatic stories of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and what she brought to the world. So I'm going to try to talk for about 40 minutes. And again, I apologize for my voice, about how Justice Ginsburg's Judaism inflected both on her life and on her doctrine as a lawyer and later as a judge. And we're going to leave heaps of time to take your questions, which you should pop in the Q&A, and hopefully together we can really think about what it is that Justice Ginsburg created and left behind Jewishly as we enter into a term that I've covered the court for 21 years, and without a doubt, this will be the most, I think, consequential term of my lifetime and yours. And so somewhere in all of this, thinking about RBG, what has come before and what is coming up, I'm hoping that we can find a Jewish lens to look at her work. So I think I want to start by saying that so much has been made of Justice Ginsburg's quintessentially Jewish life. In some ways, at least in our lifetimes, she was the most Jewish justice. And so much has been made as well of her loss at age 87 on Erev Rosh Hashanah of last year, which seemingly sealed the matter of a quintessentially Jewish passing. Her life was a testament, I think, to the words that she had framed on the walls of her chambers, the admonition, justice, justice, you shall pursue, tzedek, tzedek tirdof. In so many ways, Justice Ginsburg's story is both extraordinary and the story of almost every Jew of her generation, an almost comically typical story of the child of immigrants landed on American shores and making good in the first third of the 20th century in America. And I want to just make one other note, and it links to a seminar I had with some of your friends and colleagues from Emory this morning, which is to say, it's always a bit tricky to talk about the ways in which religion, that which we can't talk about when we talk about judges, informs the life of a jurist, because we all like to believe that judges are oracles. They're untouched by their biography, by their politics, by their ideology, and above all, that they are untouched by religious faith. But my answer on this point is to say that Justice Ginsburg would tell me right now that she herself always believed and knew that her Jewish values inflected upon her worldview, shaped her jurisprudence and her thinking, and that to imagine anything else of her would be to diminish both her life as a judge and her life as a Jew. In other words, I think she was uncomplicated in her willingness to embrace Judaism as a factor in how she thought about the world and how she thought about the law. So on to this sort of quintessential American success story. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is born March 15th, 1933 in Brooklyn, New York, to Nathan and Celia Bader. Nathan is a furrier who had immigrated to the United States from Russia at the age of 13, and Celia was the first of all of her 6 siblings to actually be born in the United States. Celia worked in a garment factory to support the family, and she was maniacal in the manner of a Philip Roth character about making sure that her daughter was educated and that her daughter succeeded and that her daughter practiced piano and that her daughter did well in the world. Celia was equally fanatical about making sure that her daughter Ruth was dedicated from an incredibly young age to a life of public service. And she encouraged 2 paradoxical qualities. She wanted Ruth, and these were the 2 pieces of advice she always offered, both to be independent, to be fiercely independent, and also to be a lady. And what that meant in Celia's construction was hold back your passions, hold back your anger, never ever show yourself to be out of control. And those 2 imperatives, to be both independent and to be a lady, turn out to be kind of the lodestars by which young Ruth Bader Ginsburg really manages her life. The other thing that Celia encouraged Ruth to do was to think in terms of women of valor, and notably Jewish women of valor. She had a list of those Jewish women of valor that she would share with Ruth and encouraged Ruth to model herself after them. And perhaps unsurprisingly, young Ruth showed a strong affinity for one of those women of valor, notably Deborah, the judge in the Book of Prophets. From a very, very young age, the idea of being an Eshet Chayil and modeling herself after those women was foremost in young Ruth's mind in terms of what she needed to be. Now, Celia worked eventually as a bookkeeper, and one of Ruth Ginsburg's favorite jokes was that only in America could the difference between a Brooklyn bookkeeper and a Supreme Court justice be a single generation. But Ruth's loss of her mother at a very, very young age really shaped how she thought about the world in so many ways, Jewishly and otherwise. And we'll get to some of them in a moment. But what I do want to say is that at her own swearing in, Justice Ginsburg expressed gratitude to her mother, who had died just as Ruth was graduating high school. And then she said that she prayed that she might be, quote, all that she would have been had she lived in an age when women could aspire and achieve, and daughters were cherished as much as sons. So even as she was being bestowed with this highest honor of the world in the United States, she was deeply, deeply saddened and aware that her mother had lived in an era where that was not possible for Celia. Now, Ruth was raised in the Jewish neighborhood of Midwood. She grew up in a quite observant home. She attended East Midwood Jewish Center, which was a conservative synagogue, and its attendant Sunday school. In the summers, Ruth would attend camp in the Adirondacks, where she was unofficially dubbed the camp junior rabbi because she would lead Shabbat prayers. Immediately after the Holocaust ended, an 8th grade Ruth wrote an essay in her synagogue bulletin. It was entitled One People, and it was about the importance of a world free of bias and hate and prejudice. She republished this essay in her 2016 book, My Own Words. And it is an astonishing piece of writing for an 8th grader. This is what she wrote at the time as the stark reminder of Holocaust survivors being relocated to her neighborhood was front of mind. She wrote this: "We must never forget the horrors which our brethren were subjected to in Bergen-Belsen and other Nazi concentration camps. There can be a happy world where there will be once again, when men can create a strong bond toward one another, a bond unbreakable by a studied prejudice or a passing circumstance." And I want to submit to you this evening that that idea of studied prejudice and passing circumstance shoots through her ideas about justice and jurisprudence for the rest of her life. In addition to being deeply, deeply aware of Holocaust refugees who were being resettled around her, young Ruth was very affected, she would later say, by going on drives with her parents and on family trips, seeing signs posted that said, "No dogs, no Jews." Equally, I think as she grew up and she went to college and thought about justice and what that meant, she was deeply impacted by the Red Scare and her sense that this was the exact opposite of what justice and equality and dignity meant. Almost everything about, I think, young Ruth's life in the law was rooted in this complicated sense, both that Jews are uniquely safe in America, that there's no place else in the world they can be this free, and the corollary sentiment that Jews are thus uniquely responsible to fight for social justice in America because they have all these privileges and therefore they have this attendant responsibility to make sure that everyone gets those privileges. And I think that these themes that lived with her throughout her life of tolerance, pluralism, dignity, diversity, equality, really were very, very much a product of her Jewish upbringing. In a speech that she gave in 2004 at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., this is what she said about her childhood as a Jew. Quote, "I was fortunate to be a child, a Jewish child, safely in America during the Holocaust. Our nation learned from Hitler's racism and in time embarked on a mission to end law-sanctioned discrimination in our own country, in the aftermath of World War II and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, in the burgeoning women's rights movements of the 1970s, we the people expanded to include all of humankind, to embrace all the people of this great nation. Our motto, E pluribus unum, of many one, signals our appreciation that we are the richer for the religious, ethnic, and racial diversity of our citizens." On the one hand, it sounds like she is saying some of the most obvious statements about American beliefs and morality and worldview. On the other hand, they were so profound to her because I think she knew how fragile and hard-fought they really were. Now, I want to talk for just a minute about Justice Ginsburg's eventual disillusionment with formal Judaism. It's something that's written about a lot, and I'm not sure it's always completely understood. There's one story she tells where she would say that her mother used to say that her extremely Orthodox grandfather destroyed her uncle's bike after he wrote it on Shabbat. And that was enough for Ruth. She thought this was too fundamentalist for her to tolerate. She was very frustrated that her cousin Richard got a bar mitzvah, quote, "but there was no comparable ceremony for me." And one of her biographers has suggested that when her father lost his business, the Jewish community, instead of surrounding him and supporting him, made him into an outcast, sort of pushed him out and belittled him. And she experienced that as a failure of Jewish community. But I also want to suggest that another deep, deep inflection point for her was when she was told She could not say Kaddish for her beloved mother, who died tragically when Ruth was 17, as I said, the day before Ruth graduated from high school. And Justice Ginsburg liked to quote Henrietta Szold, the founder of Hadassah, because Szold was one of 8 sisters who refused when a male family friend offered to say Kaddish on behalf of Henrietta Zold's mother when she died. Szold wrote to her friend, Chaim Peretz, in 1916 about this generous offer that she was about to rebuff. This is what she wrote, quote, "What you have offered to do is beautiful beyond thanks. You will wonder then that I cannot accept this offer. I know well and appreciate what you say about the Jewish custom, and Jewish custom is very dear and sacred to me, and yet I cannot ask you to say Kaddish after my mother. Kaddish means to me that the survivor publicly manifests his intention to assume the relation to the Jewish community from which his parent had, so that he can be part of the chain of tradition, and that chain remains unbroken from generation to generation, each adding its own link. You can do that for the generations of your family. I must do that for the generations of my family." And Justice Ginsburg told that story quite a lot, partly because I think it echoes in her own jurisprudence. People did things for women thinking they were being kind, thinking that they were being paternalistic and careful. But women needed to be allowed to do those things for themselves. And I think this letter, with this bold feminist read on Judaism, which was written, by the way, 4 years before the ratification of the 19th Amendment, maps so elegantly onto so much of Justice Ginsburg's future career as a feminist litigator at the ACLU, where time and time again she would say, "Thank you for seeking to do this generous thing for me. I need to be allowed to do it for myself." Now, another reason that letter mattered, Henrietta Sold's letter, is that Ginsburg would say later in an interview, that plea for celebration of our common heritage while tolerating, indeed appreciating, differences among us concerning religious practice is so captivating. I recall her words even to this day when a colleague's position betrays a certain lack of understanding. And that is mild-mannered Ruth Bader Ginsburg code for. This is a template for her to think about. How do you and I, who share a faith, who share certain beliefs, who share certain values, coexist even when our religion rubs uncomfortably against each other? And that idea of holding them both in truth, believing they both can be celebrated without diminishing the other, again, I think becomes a cornerstone of how young Ruth comes to view the world. So this is the part of the biography that is famous. I'll go quickly through it, but please, if you haven't, read the books, watch the films. She attended Cornell on a scholarship. She met and married Marty Ginsburg. She would later say that Marty was the only young man I dated who cared that I had a brain. And here's a good moment to pause and say she was absolutely breathtakingly gorgeous. So it's possible that Marty also appreciated that she was extremely attractive. She famously followed Marty to Harvard Law School. She was one of 9 women in a class of 500 people that started at Harvard together. When Marty had cancer, Ruth did all of her classwork and his, took all the notes for his class, typed his paper, got them both through that year of law school. And then she famously followed him for her last year at Columbia Law School because he had taken a job in New York. And this part of the story really is depressing, but famously she could not get a clerkship, although she graduated at the top of her class. Famously, she could not get a job, although she graduated at the top of her class. She was fired from her first job when she was seen to be pregnant. She famously had to hide her second pregnancy at Rutgers, where she was teaching, so she wouldn't be fired. And despite having door after door after door closed in her face, she goes on to become the pioneer, the architect of modern gender equality in the constitutional stratosphere. She was, as Bill Clinton said when he tapped her to be a Supreme Court justice, the Thurgood Marshall of the women's rights movement, and that was no exaggeration. So I want to turn for a minute to three, I think, key pieces of Justice Ginsburg's legal worldview and share with you how I think they are shot through with some of these Jewish values I've tried to sketch. And the first, I think, and the most important, and the one she probably talked about most openly, was what it meant to be an other in a country where even as she was succeeding up, she was never quite in the club. I think Justice Ginsburg knew throughout her career that Jews in America were drawn to the law, both because of longstanding interest in text and in law and in Talmudic debate, but also because of discrimination in America, that they couldn't get jobs in some other fields. She also knew that even within the law, Jews were not allowed at some firms, they were allowed at others. There were Jewish firms that allowed Jews to work, but didn't allow Jewish women to work. And so you get this kind of Russian doll of being included and not included, welcome and not welcome, time and time again. And I think that it allowed her to understand in a deep way that not all doors were open in America. Not all doors were open to everyone. Even doors that were open to her Jewish husband were not always open to her. And so she had this lifetime of experience hurling herself against locked doors, getting into the door eventually, and then knowing very much at all times in a kind of split screen what it's like on both sides of that door. And here I want to pause and disabuse anyone who thinks that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a radical. Because I know there's a tendency, and trust me, I have the mugs and the scarves and the tote bags to prove it. It's easy to think that she was a barnstorming feminist. She was the exact opposite. She was fundamentally the most small c conservative radical, probably in the feminist movement. She believed deeply in the institution of law. She believed deeply in the legal system. She believed in incremental, infinitesimal change to that system. And much of that is also an outgrowth of her experience as a Jew. She knew that the law protected minorities, some but not all, and that the law needed to be nudged in the right direction to protect more, and then more, and then more, and that could not be done in bold strokes. It had to be done in tiny baby steps. And I think that anyone who has the notion that she spent the 60s and 70s, burning her bras and protesting, absolutely not. She was emphatically a generation too old for that. She spent the 60s and 70s blue booking briefs, writing incredibly detailed, scrupulously fact-checked briefs and arguments. But what she was not was somebody who wanted to burn the system down. And I think she also believed, and this is important for our purposes, that judging is a deeply, deeply Jewish occupation. In that same 2004 speech that she gave at the Holocaust Museum, Justice Ginsburg explained it as follows, quote, "My heritage as a Jew and my occupation as a judge fit together symmetrically. The demand for justice runs through the entirety of Jewish history and Jewish tradition. I take pride and I draw strength from my heritage, as the signs in my chambers will attest. A large silver mezuzah on my doorpost, and on the three walls, in artist's rendition of the Hebrew letters, the command from Deuteronomy, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue." And then she went on to say, these words are ever present, reminders of what justices and judges must do so they may thrive. So if you're with me so far, that Justice Ginsburg is an institutionalist, she's an incrementalist, the furthest thing from a radical, then all we have to do is pivot to see that really her view of working for others was to bring them along behind her. I'm going to pause and wipe my nose, excuse me. In a 2017 Rosh Hashanah visit to a historic synagogue in Washington, D.C., this is what Ginsburg told worshipers. She said, "The Jewish religion is an ethical religion. That is, we are taught to do right, to love mercy, to do justice, not because there's going to be any reward in heaven or punishment in hell. We live righteously because that's how people should live, and not anticipating any award in the hereafter." And in all of her writing throughout her life, whether she's discussing voting rights, gender, disability, or yes, religion itself, you're deeply aware that she was living a split screen life at which every turn she was both on the inside, thriving in the American dream, and also somehow locked out of the American dream. And one of the central paradoxes of Justice Ginsburg's life is that in some sense, right to the end, she was an utterly conventional, upper middle class white woman. She lived at the Watergate. She went to the opera. She dressed in furs. I often tell people that on the handful of occasions when I did events with her, I was shuffling her along in flats and she was wearing 3-inch couture heels. She was fancy and she was privileged in a way that almost none of us are. But she knew her whole life that her job is to be seen and to make visible the people who do not live that life in America. And speaking at her memorial service, when she lay in state at the Supreme Court, Rabbi Lauren Holtzblatt of the Adas Israel congregation in Washington really, I think, glommed onto that notion of who RBG was in this quest to make sure everyone was seen. This is what Rabbi Holtzblatt said in her eulogy, quote, "The Torah is relentless in reminding and instructing and commanding that we never forget those who live in the shadows." And it seems to me when September 1st, and this is the only polemical thing I'll say, when the court allowed SB 8, the Texas abortion law, to go into effect, the one that effectively constructs bounty system to reward those who sue anyone who aids or abets an abortion. So clear to me was it that it was Justice Kagan writing in dissent in that order and Justice Sotomayor writing in dissent in that order. What would have been the work of Justice Ginsburg, which is to say, these are the women in the shadows. These are the women you don't see who are being harmed right here, right now. That is the work of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, in 2014, Justice Ginsburg explained in an interview why she had assigned a dissent in a really major religion case that had to do with saying prayers before city council meetings in the town of Greece, New York, where the prayers were unerringly sectarian Christian prayers. And the dissent in the case, when the court said, that's an okay system, it's constitutional, was handed to Elena Kagan. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the senior justice in the dissent, gave it to Elena Kagan to write. And later she explained why she gave it to Justice Kagan. This is what she said, pulling on that same theme. Elena was an outsider. Even in her own religion, she had to fight to be the first girl bat mitzvahed in her Orthodox synagogue. I think she has that sensitivity. It's something my colleagues don't really get because they haven't been in that situation. And so on this first point on solicitude for outsiders, I just want to suggest to you that to be an insider and an outsider at the same time is also a quintessentially Jewish American sensibility, even in an America that Ruth Bader Ginsburg loved beyond reason. To always feel a little vestigial sense that you're a stranger in a strange land, whether she was a stranger in the land of men, the stranger in the land of Christian white America, the stranger in the land of the law, allows you to hear two voices at once. And Ginsburg, I think, worked her entire life to expand the scope of who would be let in to the American dream, who was not to be treated as outside looking in. And that didn't just stem from the youthful Jewish experience of justice and equality that I've laid out for you. It also came, I think, from a lifelong sense that in America, you could be Jewish and you could succeed, and you would still have to work and work and work to make it your home and make it home for others. From this powerful sense of otherness, I want to suggest one other theme that I believe fully blossomed Jewishly through Ruth Bader Ginsburg's jurisprudence. When she took the helm at the ACLU and created the Women's Rights Project in 1972, she became a pioneer of gender equality law in America. She argued 6 gender discriminations before the Supreme Court between 1973 and 1976. She won 5 of the 6. And again, I think the same way history misunderstands her as a radical, history misunderstands what the project was there. And again, the project was not simply to help women move forward in America. Her vision of gender equality is so profound and I think so poetic. It was decades ahead of her time, decades ahead in some sense of our time. In her textbook that she co-wrote with 2 colleagues in 1974, Women in the Law, one of the first big textbooks about women in the law, Justice Ginsburg outlined the vision of gender equality. And the project wasn't simply to empower women to get men's jobs. The power was to enable members of both sexes, men and women, to assume all of society's roles and be enriched by having a fully realized life. Yes, she was fighting patriarchal stereotypes about fragile little women who couldn't serve on juries, who couldn't hold credit cards, who couldn't own their own property. True. But she deeply believed that those attitudes hurt men as much as they hurt women. She really believed that men were as trapped in those gender designated roles as women were trapped in their own gender designated roles. And I want to read to you a paragraph in that textbook, which only later did we learn she wrote alone, not with her co-authors. Quote, "The very assurance of their dominance marks out for even greater social approval men whose unconventional interests and abilities lead them to choose different lifestyles. Only when men and women are able to see themselves and each other without preconceptions as human beings will the underlying support for sex-based discrimination disappear." And again, all of the early cases that she brought looked as though they were a party trick. She was arguing on behalf of men in front of male judges, and she was asking that they be allowed to do what women could do: raise their children after the mother died, collect spousal benefits that a woman would have been eligible for. It's not a trick. It was never a trick that would help male judges understand gender disparity by identifying with a man. She truly believed that equality meant that men could live fuller, richer lives if they could do all those things, if they could stay at home with their children, if they could take care of an ailing parent, because if we got rid of those barriers and stereotypes, both sides would benefit. And I want to really emphasize to you that I think that the idea that Justice Ginsburg was fighting for her own equality tells only half the story. She was always fighting, I think, for Marty, her husband, and for her son to be able to live. Marty was a cook. James was an artist and a musician. To be able to live fully realized lives separate from the boundaries of narrow gender roles. So the last way that I think Justice Ginsburg's Judaism really inflects upon and informs her career, both as a judge and as a lawyer, is this much maligned notion of civility. Justice Ginsburg gets a bad rap because it is true, it wasn't a trick. She and Justice Scalia were deep, lifelong friends, despite massive, massive differences of opinion and ideology. She would never have said or written anything that would wound him. And toward the end of her career, even as her voice changed and she became the notorious RBG, and she wrote tart dissents, and she wrote quotable bits of prose that became, memes and rap songs, throughout all of that, she would attack ideas, yes, fiercely, the idea of not having equality in voting, the idea of not having LGBTQ equality, but she never attacked her colleagues. And at a moment when everyone else at the court was starting to turn up the temperature and go for the jugular, Justice Ginsburg always said that her mother-in-law, Marty's mom, famously said, the best marital advice I can give you is always be a little bit deaf. And Justice Ginsburg used to love the idea that she was a little bit deaf at every moment in which she would be tempted to lose her temper and say something that she would later regret. And one of the mottos that Justice Ginsburg imposed on young women, on her clerks, on anybody who asked for advice was, quote, fight for the things you care about, but always do it in a way that will lead others to join you. In other words, Justice Ginsburg was not a soloist. She never was. She never saw justice as being a solo sport. She was so careful throughout her work to credit the women who came before her, to credit the allies who came to support her. I interviewed her very, very shortly before the court shut down for COVID, and asked about being in that class of 9 women and 500 men at Harvard. And I said, tell me the famous story where Dean Griswold, the dean of the law school, made all the women stand up and say, oh, I'm taking the place of a man because. And she had in her head at that point rewritten that story to say, oh, he gets a bad rap. He did so much to make sure that Harvard Law School was co-educated. I think it was a bad joke. She said, he was really, really good to us as women. And that impulse to forever build bridges, to forever forgive, to forever be collegial drives us crazy sometimes, because it often felt, I think, that she was bringing, a shrimp fork to a knife fight. But her view of the world was always, and it goes back to my prior point, lift both sides up. Don't do anything that will shame or diminish or embarrass the other side, because someday you're going to need them as an ally. One of the things that I love to tell about her is that she really believed that the single best gift she had in drafting opinions and writing opinions was that she would swap her draft opinions with Justice Scalia. And trust me, they were not often on the same side in cases. And when she famously wrote her opinion in the Virginia Military Institute case, where for the first time the Virginia Military Institute was going to be co-educated, in some ways the crown jewel of her career as a gender equality lawyer, she swapped drafts with Justice Scalia. And this is what she said, and I think, again, it goes to this notion of lift up the other side. She said, my final draft was more persuasive thanks to Justice Scalia's searing criticism. Indeed, whenever I wrote for the court and received a Scalia dissent, the majority opinion ultimately released improved on my initial circulation. So every draft that she got back from him made her look better. And again, I feel as though in a moment when we are so zero-sum, when we are so willing to burn everything down every day based on a tweet or a quirked eyebrow, to go back to that vision of, how do I keep this person on side? How do I make them my ally? How do I avoid the vitriol and the burning of a relationship that I can't repair? And I think it came from a deep, deep, deep place, as I said, of community, of civility, of subordinating individual ego to the success of the long-term project. And I think it goes to this, forgive me, deeply Jewish notion that maybe it's not worth blowing up if you can save it and make it a little better. And when she visited Israel in 2018 to get a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Genesis Prize Foundation, Ginsburg said she was driven by Jewish values of pursuing justice, as I said, of tikkun olam, of repairing the world. And even though that idea feels so old-fashioned to us right now, and civility feels old-fashioned, right or wrong, it was essential, I would say central, to Justice Ginsburg's view of what we would need to do to repair the world. And so for so many women, myself included, the loss of Justice Ginsburg last year, that steadying voice, that voice that said, make the vulnerable visible and work to make sure that everyone rises up and that nobody is diminished in your attempt to elevate yourself. And that voice of, before you break the thing, see if you can repurpose and recycle it to make it something better for everyone. All of those lodestars, at least for me, as a lawyer, as a feminist, as a public thinker, have really cratered. And I have felt in many, many ways, a big RBG-shaped hole in the world in which I used to reside. And I think that for so many women, the loss of Justice Ginsburg has been painful, not because she was a radical, but because in a sense, she had this incrementalist, institutionalist, small ball view of repair that for me feels like it came straight from my mother and my grandmothers and my great-grandmothers and a lot of women that I know. It feels like that big voice is really lost. And I want to close, if I may, by quoting Rabbi Rothschild in his tribute speech that he gave to Dr. King in 1965 to honor Dr. King after he'd been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. This is what he said. In Jewish lore, there is a legend of Adam as he faced the approaching night of his first day on earth. Darkness, the first darkness he had ever known, was about to envelop the world, and he was afraid. For how was he to know that night and day were ordained to follow one another for all eternity, that God in his first creative act had decreed that there be light, and indeed had looked upon it and called it good? And when I have those moments of feeling that I'm not sure what the light looks like tomorrow, and staring down the barrel of a term in which it feels like so very, very many of Justice Ginsburg's most cherished values have really been or are being in front of our eyes pared away, I like to connect that statement to something that Justice Ginsburg said, again in that Holocaust memorial speech in 2004. This is what she said, quote, "The Passover story we tell and retell is replete with miracles. But unlike our ancestors from Egypt, our way is unlikely to be advanced by miraculous occurrences. In striving to drain dry the waters of prejudice and oppressions, we must rely on the measures of our own creation, upon the wisdom of our laws and the decency of our institutions, upon our reasoning minds and our feeling hearts, as a constant spark to carry on, upon our vivid memories of the evils we wish to banish from the world." So as you and I and everyone we know takes a moment to journey up and down this ladder from lofty, sometimes unattainable aspiration of what it is to do tikkun olam, what it is to be an eshet chayil, what it is to repair the world, and takes it out to the communities all around us, to our families, to our friends, to our synagogues and the institutions in which we belong. I would ask you to join yourselves to this seemingly impossible task of just doing step by step, small bore, deeply respectful repair to ensure that the other side isn't suffering, losing dignity, but that we are all lifted up together. I know it's not going to happen tomorrow, but I think that Justice Ginsburg would say, it's coming. So thank you very, very much for being with me and for bearing with my snuffly nose. And I'm delighted, if I may, to answer any and all questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dahlia, for a wonderful presentation. We have time to take questions. I just want to remind people to please enter your questions in the using the Q&A function, not by raising your hand, because we can't see you all, but we can see the questions coming through the Q&A, and I will moderate some of the questions. And because we're getting many questions, I will sometimes try to combine similar questions. The more succinct you can make your question, the better it is for me to convey it in a quick fashion. Here's one about the relationship between Justice Ginsburg and some of the other justices. We know a lot about the relationship with Justice Scalia, which you mentioned. What about the relationship between Justice Ginsburg and Sandra Day O'Connor? Is there something you can tell us about that? And did they have similar experiences as the two women on the Supreme Court at one time, or did their experiences diverge?
First, there's a tremendous book, if you haven't read it, by Linda Hirschman called Sisters-in-Law, which really fronts the very, very complicated relationship between Justices Ginsburg and O'Connor. And one of the things that's really fascinating is that even though O'Connor was appointed by Ronald Reagan and Ginsburg was appointed by Bill Clinton, and even though in a lot of deep ways they felt like really different generations of feminists, we forget there actually was not a huge age difference between them. But Justice O'Connor was such a prototypical, I grew up on a ranch and I was herding steer before I could walk, and I picked myself up by the bootstraps and have no patience for anybody who doesn't do the same. I mean, she in that sense came to her conservatism based on a life that could not be more different than the life I outlined for you of a Ruth Bader Ginsburg growing up in Brooklyn, surrounded by incredible diversity and Holocaust refugees, and really deeply, deeply affected by the Red Scare. So it's funny to me sometimes that not only were, they appointed by a Democrat and appointed by a Republican, and not only were they in some sense really different generations in terms of their views of women and women's rights, but the most amazing thing personally is that they were dear, dear friends, and that's in some sense not amazing at all. They each supported each other through their respective bouts of cancer. They each were absolutely fiendish about Justice O'Connor had this famous Jane Fonda workout class when the men on the Supreme Court were playing basketball. The justices and their clerks played, here's a fun fact, the top floor of the Supreme Court has a basketball court dubbed the highest court in the land. And on that court, while the men and their male clerks were playing basketball, Justice O'Connor had this, I think for a while, mandatory women's Jane Fonda workout aerobics class. I think the first person who declined to go to the aerobics class as a clerk was Elena Kagan, then clerking for Thurgood Marshall. But they really had this deep, almost fun sense that the two of them together were making the court different, making the court a place for women. And here's the statistical fact that I love to share about the two of them, because I think it's actually important and goes to this question of, you can pretend that your life, your experience, your backstory doesn't affect your jurisprudence, but here's what the data says. For all the years that these two women sat together at the Supreme Court, on virtually every case, they had aggregated across their careers about a 50% disagreement rate. That's to be expected when you have a conservative and a liberal, a Republican and a Democrat. Here's the data point that I really want you to take home. In cases that had to do with sexual harassment or with women's reproductive freedom or gender, they agreed 90% of the time. So that tendency to have almost perfect confluence of vision only shows up around gender cases. And there's all sorts of meta studies that crunch the numbers. And that suggests to me in a really interesting way that there is a woman's view of the world, a woman's sense of how law affects women, and that women judge from it. So it was very, very interesting that even though on political matters, I mean, think about Bush v. Gore, think about the many ways they found themselves on opposite sides of cases. On cases that had to do with gender, they were aligned virtually all the time across their careers. And I think in a funny sense, they did feel as though they were bringing each other along on that front. Maybe the only other thing I will say, because I say it often, is that Justice O'Connor famously, when she was asked, is there a specific kind of women's jurisprudence? Is there a way that women decide cases? Justice would famously say time and again, a wise old man and a wise old woman in the fullness of experience will arrive at the same result in a case. Justice Ginsburg had no patience for that, did not believe it at all, believed very much that women would arrive at different results, particularly in gender cases. And ironically, and I'll end here, Justice Ginsburg only changed in a lot of very foundational ways after Justice O'Connor left the court. Justice Ginsburg, when she became the one woman with 8 men on the bench, and she had the experience, because don't forget, Justice O'Connor came first, of being the only, she really started to say to the press, to anyone who would listen, we need another woman on this court. These men do not, she would say it again, the most civil, gentle construction of the sentence, but she would say, these men don't always share my sensibilities. And that was her code to President Obama, that when Justice Souter stepped down, it would be time to be picking a woman, which he did. Her name was Sonia Sotomayor.
Thank you. I'm going to sort of combine a few questions. You gave us a portrait that one of the things that emanated from her Jewish background was a belief in the system, that the system could ultimately work, especially for minority groups, that this informed her approach of an incrementalism. And yet there are many different minority groups who have grievances and claims and things that would come before the court. And those groups may experience different treatment under the law. How aware was she that her experience as a Jew who had experienced a process of gradual inclusion and acceptance might not be as applicable to the experience of, say, African Americans or even women in general, or women of color, or LGBTQ individuals? And was she aware that a process of incrementalism may be a way of telling some groups you have to wait for equality?
So I want to be clear, and I probably should have included this in my main remarks, that without a doubt, Justice Ginsburg had some real blind spots, particularly on issues of race. She had an appalling rate of, for instance, hiring Black clerks, appalling. And famously, shortly before she died, she gave an interview to Katie Couric where she said something about Colin Kaepernick and taking the knee that just reflected a deep, deep misapprehension of what Kaepernick was trying to do and what it was to fight for racial justice in sports. She walked that back, by the way. So there were certainly areas in which living at the Watergate and, wearing couture shoes blinkered her to some of the realities of the world. That said, I feel as though one of Justice Ginsburg's superpowers was that she didn't only feel empathy for people like her. And you need only read her opinion, for instance, in the Lilly Ledbetter case, a case where a woman working for Goodyear Tire was for years and years and years and years shorted on her paychecks and didn't know about it. And it's an amazing thing to read Justice Ginsburg insert herself into the shoes of a woman working at Goodyear Tire and experiencing that kind of pay discrimination and able to imagine what that looks like. Probably her most famous dissent is in Shelby County versus Holder. That was the case where the court really eviscerated a big chunk of the Voting Rights Act. And Justice Ginsburg, writing in that case about what it was like to be a person of color in the South and be denied the right to vote, is really, really deeply, deeply aware of what that looks like. And right before COVID, again, writing about what it is to be a voter, standing in line in Wisconsin, trying to vote, being a person of color in Milwaukee in COVID, none of those things were things she experienced. And yet she was able to imagine herself into them. And so I think that the short, crisp answer is that, of course, incrementalism is a very frustrating answer if you have radical problems. But I think that the failure was not of Justice Ginsburg's empathy for people who look nothing like her, whose lives she couldn't possibly have recognized, and yet she found herself in it.
Thank you. This is drawing on a few different questions about her relationship with some of the other justices. One is about, you mentioned how Justice Scalia, how that relationship reflected her principle of civility. Did the relationship have a particular influence on Justice Scalia in terms of maybe making him more sensitive in any way? Similarly, what was her relationship with Clarence Thomas, and did the Anita Hill case shape that relationship in any significant way? And finally, was she aware of the religious backgrounds and influences of the other justices, and was that something on which they interacted or discussed?
So there's a lot. There's a lot there. I would start with Justice Scalia. I interviewed each of them about why they were so fond of each other, so improbably fond of each other. And they each said to me, "This is the funniest person I know. They make me laugh." She thought he was snot out your nose hilarious. He thought, I don't know why, because I didn't find her particularly funny, but he thought she was very funny. And also he said, she's the smartest person I know. And so that's how they talked about each other. I don't think she softened him. I think that he felt like this was a roller derby and he was happy throwing punches. He famously would write really very mean things about Justice O'Connor sometimes in ways that actually pushed her away from him over the years. I think he found it harder and harder to pick up a vote from O'Connor because he would write things like, her opinion is scarcely to be believed, and was very dismissive. And I think Justice Ginsburg tried to give him that lesson of allyship, that you do not want to burn a bridge here. You might need her sometimes. And I think it fell on deaf ears. So I don't think she softened him at all, but I do think it speaks immensely well of him, that he had the capacity to do exactly the reciprocal version of what she was doing, which is have a friend with whom he disagreed so fundamentally and managed to privilege the friendship over the differences. On Justice Thomas, she never said a bad word about him. I never heard her say a bad word about him. And indeed, after Justice Kavanaugh was confirmed and roiled women in America in a way that was shocking and traumatic for a lot of women, Justice Ginsburg was at pains to say, that's over, he's lovely, he's a colleague, we're moving on. She would not say a single bad thing about him. And finally, on the question of religion, I can't think of a time that she ever said the sentence that people are thinking, which is, how is it possible that a court of 5 Catholics and 3 Jews and 1 Protestant keeps finding for abortion or finding against abortion rights, I never heard her respond to that directly. If she felt as though religion was shaping the viewpoints of her colleagues, particularly in cases that she cared about, like the COVID cases and the abortion cases, she never put it in writing.
There are some questions about her thinking leading up to, before her death, about possible retirement and how she's maybe struggled with or how she thought about the issue of retirement, especially in relationship to your comments about how she believed that people needed to suppress their own egos, and how that may have figured into her thinking about retirement.
This is the question I'm asked most often, and I think I put this under huge blind spots. I think the short answer is she genuinely believed that Hillary Clinton was going to win the 2016 election and that she was going to be replaced by Hillary Clinton. I think there's a slightly more complicated story that I'll share, right or wrong, which is I think she felt it was very sexist that she was being pressured to step off the court. I think she felt that nobody was pushing John Paul Stevens off the court, and he was significantly older than she was. And she had witnessed, don't forget, then Chief Justice William Rehnquist pushing Sandra Day O'Connor off the court before O'Connor was ready to retire. If folks recall, they were both trying to retire the same summer. Rehnquist had thyroid cancer. O'Connor went to him and said, I'm going to go next year. My husband, John, is very sick. You go now, you're sick, and that way we don't have 2 retirements in 1 year, which is anathema to the court. And the Chief Justice said, I'm going to stick around, you go now. So she retired because the Chief Justice refused to, and then the Chief Justice promptly died, and there were 2 vacancies at the same time. Had Justice O'Connor stayed on that one more year, at that point, her husband was already hospitalized. She wasn't able to stay home and take care. Justice O'Connor, I think, believed she would have had several more years at the court. And whether or not you accept that telling of that story, I think it very much shaped what Justice Ginsburg saw as men pushing Sandra Day O'Connor off the court before O'Connor was ready, and really doctrine in some areas, religion, abortion, affirmative action collapsing in O'Connor's absence. So I think that's some of what was on her mind. And I would say the last thing that was on her mind, right or wrong, is if you believe the story I'm telling you about this not being a solo sport, I think what she would say was kind of the same thing Justice Breyer is saying right now in his maddening book, which is if you care about this, vote about this. People could go out and vote. There was a vacancy. There were 3 octogenarians on the court in 2016 and 1 vacancy, and people didn't vote. By a 2-to-1 margin, they voted for Donald Trump. And I think her argument would be, this isn't on me, pal. This is on you all. If you didn't show up and pull the lever for my girl, then please don't put this on me. Again, whether that's me making excuses, her making excuses, I think part of the notion that democracy is a team sport is that this cannot be laid on her. It can, in some measure, be laid on people who saw that that seat was open and failed to be galvanized to go out and vote around issues around the court.
You mentioned Henrietta Szold as someone that she, referred to and viewed as a model in her approach to issues around gender and Judaism. Were there any other particular women, path breakers that she referred to or that she held up as models in her career?
Emma Lazarus was the other one. Those were her 2 sort of Jewish rock stars.
Or non-Jewish women as well.
And so those were her 2 like Eshet Chayil people that she would talk about. The person that I have been really, really affected by, who she held out as a role model, is a woman by the name of Polly Murray. And nobody in America has heard of Polly Murray, but there's a fabulous new documentary. And so I'm going to urge everybody to watch it. It's called My Name is Polly Murray. Polly Murray was an African-American activist, thinker, every single thing that Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg did in their kind of craftsmanship of constitutional law, Pauli Murray had already done. Pauli Murray was doing sit-ins before sit-ins had happened. Pauli Murray got arrested for refusing to get off the bus before Rosa Parks. History has completely erased Pauli Murray, in some ways, really tragically, because she was African American, in some ways because she presented as a woman and self-identified as a man, and in some ways because toward the end of her career, Pauli Murray, who, by the way, wrote a note to Richard Nixon and said, you know who should be the first woman on the court? This person. She was a fascinating character that history has almost completely erased. When RBG wrote the brief in Doe v. Reed, which was one of the first really seminal cases that she brought about gender equality, she put Pauli Murray's name on the brief as a co-author. Pauli Murray had not authored that brief with her, but Pauli Murray had done a paper arguing some of these arguments about equality decades earlier. And I think that one of the things, again, RBG, every time she had the opportunity to say, you know, I stand on the shoulders of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I stand on the shoulders, she would always talk about Pauli Murray. And I use it as an example, not just of the complete accidents of who gets famous, who becomes a rock star and who doesn't. Pauli Murray, by every metric, should have been a rock star. But again, that generosity that allowed Justice Ginsburg to always think, sort of err but by the grace of God, it wouldn't have been me. It could have been someone else. And so she would name check all these people. And to me, one last fun fact about Pauli Murray, the brief in Brown versus Board of Education was built entirely on the legal defense funds appropriating of a paper she wrote in law school, that Pauli Murray wrote in law school about equal protection, that someone pilfered from a drawer and used as the spine of this brief. Pauli Murray didn't find out that that brief used her work until years later. And so I think for me, again, that RBG, not just careful to say, you know, Dean Erwin Griswold at Harvard gets a bad rap. He was a good guy. Antonin Scalia gets a bad rap. Great ally, but to just keep naming these women and to say, maybe you haven't heard of Pauli Murray, but I'm putting her name on the brief because this is her work. And again, I think that's some kind of very, very cool practice in a moment when we're all obsessed with individual success.
This is a question that I'm sure you get very frequently, but there are many people who want you to sort of channel Justice Ginsburg and say, you know, what do you think she would say about the current docket, and particularly on abortion rights, and in more generally, how would she feel about the rightward direction of the court today?
One of the things that I've thought about so much, Eric, is how she would have felt about being replaced by another woman and how complicated that would have been, that her seat was filled by Amy Coney Barrett, in some ways, a massive feminist success story, a mother of children, a brilliant, accomplished former Supreme Court clerk, law professor, someone who by every single measure was RBG's dream successor, except for the fact that Amy Coney Barrett is going to, as you note, be a part of systematically dismantling so many of the ideas that RBG fought to protect. And I just wonder how complicated that must be for her. I think she would probably say it's a success for feminism that I've been replaced by a feminist that I completely disagree with on all particulars, because in some sense it means we've come a long way. But I think on the merits, there is no doubt in my mind that she would be horrified at the possibility that as soon as next month, December 1st, when the court hears the Dobbs case, that's the Mississippi 15-week abortion challenge, where Mississippi is not just asking for a 15-week ban, but is asking the court to overturn Roe and Casey in their entirety. I think she would be horrified that that happened that quickly. I think she was certainly very clear all through the end of COVID, when the court was was upholding state lockdown measures, even as against very, very compelling claims from religious adherents who wanted to gather and worship. The court was systematically saying, we're not substituting our judgment for state health officials. We're going to let the lockdown stand, and people will have to be patient. The minute she comes on the court, that flips, and the court starts willy-nilly striking all those lockdown orders down. The court just heard a gun case last week for the first time since Heller in over a decade. These are all cases that she was on the other side of. And so in the simplest sense, I think she would be horrified that so much of her work, of the court's work on voting rights, on LGBTQ rights, on workers' rights are being dismantled. But I would suggest one more thing. I think she would be horrified that precedent is being run over roughshod, because I think the incrementalist in her, the part of her that said, we do this bit by bit, we do it bit by bit in no small measure because public legitimacy determined entirely by how we conduct ourselves and comport ourselves. And I think she would be very upset that in the span of just a year since her death, we've seen the court just sweep away precedent, really entertain ideas about which precedent is binding or not, because I think that goes to the institutionalism question. And I deeply believe, again, that she would have prioritized the institution and public regard for the institution over and above the doctrine itself. And I think for her, the idea that for the first time since Gallup has started polling, the court's poll numbers are at 37%, I think that would make her weep, because she cared deeply, deeply that the public esteem and revere the court the way she did.
Thank you. We're about out of time, but I want to just ask one last question that asks more about her private life and how about her children. And can you say anything about the particular influence or ways that her career affected her children?
I would say these things. You know, her daughter, and again, if you watch, I think, both the films about her, both the biopic on the basis of sex and the film itself, the Notorious RBG, both of them really, I think, hold up how fractious initially her relationship with her daughter Jane was, because Jane really was of a generation that was burning its bras and had no patience for incrementalism and thought institutionalists were stupid and boring and that it was time to get stuff done, and had very little patience with the extent to which, when she was very young, her mother was kind of a get-along character. Of course, you know, her daughter now has her own life in the legal academy and has really, I think, embraced so many of the things that Justice Ginsburg was sort of laying out. But I think that for certain, it can be said that her children, at least initially, felt that she was not present in the way, you know, other people's mommies were present in the 1970s. And again, this goes to the point about, I think her kids thought that they had a little booklet called Mommy Laughed, where they would like make notations whenever she laughed out loud. And at least to hear her kids talk about it, like the booklet was always empty. Like I think they found her to be very, very serious and sober, although both her son and her daughter, although famously, you know, her granddaughter has gone on to become in some ways a spokeswoman, works at the ACLU, was the person to whom RBG turned right before her death and said, please tell them not to replace me until after the election. So I think that in a way, you know, whatever those weird interpersonal weirdnesses of having a mom who was a rock star, but she was a rock star who also sort of was just mincing along, doing the right thing and being an incrementalist. I think her kids had deeply, deeply loving relationships. And I should have noted from the outset, her relationship with her husband was a love story for the ages. I mean, talk about, Jacob and Rachel, they revered each other in ways that I can't think of other couples like that. And so even though I think she came across as a little frosty and a little guarded and a little bit cold, I think that these intimate relationships were deeply warm and loving and respectful. And I think that they all felt that she had done exactly what she had to do to be where she was.
Thank you, Dahlia. This has been a wonderful lecture. We appreciate you being here with us. And thank you to everyone in the audience for viewing. Stay tuned. Look at your mailboxes for information about our next big program in the spring, the Tenenbaum Family Lecture in Judaic Studies, which will be focusing on the theme of Judaism, environmentalism, and climate change. And that will be taking place toward the end of March. Thank you again. Thank you, Dahlia. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and good night.